The HBO series Game of Thrones, based on author George R.R. Martin's fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire, is currently one of the most popular television shows around the world, and at face value it's easy to see why. It's got dragons and direwolves, epic battles and gorgeous production values, political intrigue, and, let's face it, an appealing amount of sex and nudity. These various elements come together to create a show that almost anyone can be entertained by, even if you can't keep track of the characters or don't know exactly what's going on. Whether watched casually or obsessively, it's a highly watchable show, one that only seems to be amassing more fans with each passing season. Unlike most works of fantasy, Game of Thrones seems to attract even those that would normally never even glance at this genre, such as my father, who has never had any interest in it. For him and many others, fantasy has always been a bit of a hard sell, and that's because its nature is such that much of it isn't immediately familiar or relatable. Sure, all the sword and sorcery is fun to a certain extent, but much of the genre follows a certain kind of storytelling and tropes that, to the average person, all kind of blends together into something that for a long time didn't command much respect outside of its audience. And what little most do know about fantasy comes from Tolkien and the many imitations that followed, which typically involves end-of-the-world scenarios, prophetic chosen heroes, and a merry band of friends and allies who must work together to defeat an all-consuming evil force. There is of course magic, which usually plays an integral part, and since its rules are subject to the whims of the author, it can and often is used as a narrative shortcut or a storytelling crutch to get characters out of life and death situations. Even The Lord of the Rings, the most prestigious and influential fantasy series of all time, is guilty of this, bringing Gandalf back to life after his heart-wrenching sacrifice. It also doesn't help matters that fantasy is often filled with entire fictional worlds and characters with strange, hard-to-pronounce names. It's grand and epic and really awesome when done well, but to the average person it can look downright silly sometimes, especially when a certain percentage of the fanbase takes it really seriously. And this is why it has only appealed to a small subset of the population, which is not to minimize the value of this genre and its effect on literature and modern storytelling. Indeed, it is because of its intense, demanding nature that most people just can't get into fantasy. Engaging with fantasy, especially in the written form, takes great imagination and mental concentration to appreciate the artistry and world building going on. Nothing is familiar, and so it takes time to understand the logistics of the world, which can lead a less enthused audience member down a path of confusion and eventually a lack of interest. All this and more is why fantasy, at least until recently, has long been ignored or even looked down upon as a lesser art form, and why there has always been this barrier that stopped the average person from engaging with the material. And then there is Game of Thrones, which, despite being just as complex as other works of fantasy, is almost immediately engaging, and the reason is that George R.R. Martin took a genre that was notoriously plot-driven and crafted a story that was more driven by the characters and the struggles they go through in a dangerous and uncertain world. Obviously, Game of Thrones does have a plot, but it's very loosely structured, so much so that narrative momentum actually suffers at times. His books are notorious for being long and drawn out, with pages upon pages dedicated to scene setting and world building. An entire chapter can consist of just one scene, and yet go on for pages, to the point where at times it almost feels aimless. And that's because Martin is more concerned with the emotional state of his characters. He focuses more on real, raw, human emotion over narrative drive. This is no more apparent in the fact that 5 books in, and winter still seems no closer to coming than when the series started. It's this focus on the inner struggles of the characters that makes Game of Thrones much more viscerally compelling than most of the competition, and it's a distinction that permeates through almost every aspect of this story. Take the role of magic, for instance. As said before, a lot of fantasy treats it as a tool that can be whipped out and used at any moment, but Martin goes the opposite route. He uses magic sparingly. It's mysterious, dark, and dangerous. Every instance of its use comes at a cost, and all of this means that when it is used, which isn't that often, it's shocking, a huge event with major implications on the story. Magic is significant in Game of Thrones precisely because it is kept to minimal use. And keeping magic to the background also makes Martin's fantasy more grounded. It feels real, its characters feel like real people. You feel you know them enough to the point where you could walk up to them and shake their hand, or in Tyrion's case, have a drink with. It's also very realistically portrayed. There is no pure good or pure evil, no easy answer to morally complex situations. Actions have consequences, and unlike most fiction in general, Martin follows up on the actions of his characters to their logical and too often horrifying conclusion. There is no magical formula for escaping an inescapable situation, no omnipresent god to call upon. Sure, many of the characters, like Melisandre, are deeply religious and even present some evidence for their belief, but just like real life, no one is sure what what they are seeing or experiencing is an act of God or something else we just don't understand. Prophecy does play a role, but just like everything else, Martin subverts it, and so instead of being a life-affirming answer to the higher mysteries, it is messy, inconsistent, and often contradictory, and actually raises more questions than answers. In a lot of ways, Martin has created a world that feels temporal in its depiction of spirituality, which isn't in line with most fantasy. While the narrative does give the audience a sense of what they think is happening, it never confirms it. Martin probably wants to leave the question of whether there is a God or not as just that, a question, one we think we have the answer to, but don't. All we can do is fumble around the dark and hope we make it out to the other side. But then you have Jon Snow, who, at least in the show, has died and come back. Aside from Beric Dondarrion, he's the only main character to have gone through the experience of actually dying and being dead. He has a perspective on existence that no one else has. And what does he learn?
Nothing. There was nothing at all.
By itself, this doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a God, but Jon knows that what awaits at the end of this world isn't his father Ned, or Ygritte, or anyone else he's ever or will ever love. There is nothing, and yet Jon is back. There is no disputing that. Does that mean that the Lord of Light is real? Maybe, maybe not. And then there are the others, the White Walkers, the supposed agents of the Great Other. Up until season 6, we knew virtually nothing about them, and when we finally did learn something new, we found out that they aren't the commanding officers of an evil deity's army, but are actually the creations of the Children of the Forest, a weapon forged in response to man's destructive, all-consuming nature. They are an experiment gone wrong, which sounds more like something out of a science fiction story than fantasy. It is yet another subversion of a common trope, this time of the all-consuming evil power, but functionally remains the same. They are death incarnate, a seemingly unstoppable force that uses our dead loved ones to kill us. It will destroy all of Westeros if they don't stop fighting each other and band together for the greater good. In fact, the more mankind fights amongst themselves, the stronger the White Walkers become. They use our thirst for war as a weapon against us, building their army while the armies of man dwindle. In this story, man's greatest enemy is himself. It is solely the people of Westeros, or more specifically those of higher social standing, that are responsible for their own problems. While men with everything hide in high towers, thousands of people are forcefully separated from their families to fight battles for those they've never met, and for a cause they likely have little to no knowledge of. As a handful of aristocrats squabble over power, the unheard masses of innocents suffer, serving a system that functions only to serve itself at the expense of everyone else, or as Daenerys says,
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
It's a beautiful dream. Stopping the wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
Despite the presence of dragons, ice zombies, and faceless assassins, the world of Game of Thrones is strikingly similar to ours. It is a very modern fantasy series, one that examines human nature by diving headfirst into its heart, forcing the audience to look, no matter how dark it gets. It's about life and death and our relationship to it, how it influences the choices we make in the course of each and every one of our lives. And we, the audience, see this play out in the lives of our beloved characters, each one a subjective window into a mythology that's as familiar as it is different. And that is the real reason we love Game of Thrones. Yes, it has all the trappings of high-budget fantasy, but we watch because we love the characters. We identify with almost all of them because every one of them represents a part of ourselves. We feel Arya's sense of loss when she sees her father beheaded in front of her. We empathize with the constant injustices Tyrion experiences simply because he is different, and cheer when he fights back with his superior intellect. We seethe with rage when we see Joffrey abuse the power that doesn't belong to him, and we root for Jon Snow simply because he is a good person, trying to do the right thing even when he isn't sure what that is. Game of Thrones is about us. Its scope allows it to explore the human condition on a vast canvas, asking important fundamental questions about the human heart in a way that's endlessly entertaining and leaves you wanting more. We want Westeros to survive just like we want our world to survive, against an increasingly chaotic and uncertain future, one held back by our inability to see the big picture and work together for the common good. And as our own White Walkers bear down on us in one form or another, we turn to Westeros and its cast of unforgettable characters for answers.